A single iron key unlocked the most dangerous room in Henry VIII's palace, and it rested in the hands of Katherine Tylney. Standing in the pitch-black corridor, she listened to the muffled sounds of Queen Catherine Howard's treasonous affairs, fully aware that she was an active accomplice. Every night was a terrifying gamble, where a single approaching footstep from the king's guards meant a direct trip to the torture rack. When the king's wrath finally fell, Tilney did not hesitate to trade her mistress's head for her own survival. With cold calculation, she delivered a chillingly precise confession that exposed every dirty secret she had helped hide. She walked away with a royal pardon, while her exact words dragged the queen directly to the chopping block. King Henry VIII's palaces were heavily guarded and constantly watched. By 1541, locations like Whitehall Palace were filled with rival political and religious groups. People living there had no privacy. Catholics and Protestants paid servants to spy on each other. These spies gathered information that could lead to treason charges against powerful nobles. In this environment, the king's marriage was public business. The queen was the most watched person in England. Her main job was to give birth to a male heir for the Tudor family. Because of this, her ladies-in-waiting tracked where she went, who she saw, and her daily health. Hiding a secret required extreme care or poor judgment. The tension at court worsened as King Henry VIII's health failed. By the early 1540s, Henry was 50 years old and no longer active. He could no longer hunt or joust like he did in his youth. He developed serious medical problems and gained a massive amount of weight. He eventually became so heavy that he needed machines to help him get on his horse. His weight was just one of his major health issues. After a bad jousting accident in 1536, Henry developed severe leg sores. Doctors at the time believed they had to keep these wounds open to stop infections. Every day, doctors drained the wounds, which caused the king terrible pain. He often had to stay in bed for weeks at a time. The king's illness affected the daily mood of the entire court. His infected legs caused a strong, bad smell in his private rooms. Foreign visitors often wrote letters home about this noticeable odor. The constant pain also made Henry angry and paranoid. He stopped trusting people and began executing his closest advisors. When Henry executed his top minister, Thomas Cromwell, in 1540, it showed that no one was safe. Cromwell had led the Protestant changes in England and kept Catholic nobles out of power. His death left a large empty space in the government. Catholic leaders saw this as their chance to take control. They quickly worked to gain the aging king's favor. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner led this Catholic group. They understood how to manage the king's temper and pride. Henry had just ended an embarrassing short marriage to Anne of Cleves. He wanted a young wife to show everyone he was still strong and capable. The Catholic leaders knew a new wife would give them control over the court. The group chose Catherine Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's young niece. They did not care if she understood politics. They just needed her to attract the king. Historians believe she was around 15 to 17 years old at the time. If she became queen, she could help change laws back to Catholic traditions. Her family used her purely as a tool to gain power. Catherine was not ready for the strict rules of the English court. Unlike Henry's previous wives, she had very little education or training. She was lively and charming, which the king liked, but she lacked common sense. Henry married her in July 1540. He believed she was perfect and that she made him feel young again. At first, the plan worked very well for the Catholic leaders. Catherine's youth improved the king's mood and his public behavior, Henry gave her large pieces of land, expensive jewelry, and a lot of attention. The Catholic groups secured their power, while the Protestants lost their influence. However, this political success was not going to last long. The Howard family made a major mistake by ignoring Catherine's feelings. They forced a teenager to marry a sick man who was 33 years older. Catherine had to live with Henry's daily medical routines and his bad temper. Feeling lonely and trapped, she looked for a way out. She started talking to people from her past to find some comfort. Catherine's problems actually started years before, when she lived at her grandmother's house. The adults there did not supervise the teenagers properly. Boys and girls spent time together in the sleeping areas without permission. During this time, Catherine had secret relationships with young men. Other girls saw everything and later brought these dangerous secrets to the royal court. When the Howard faction successfully maneuvered Catherine into the king's bed, abruptly plucking her from this chaotic adolescence and crowning her Queen of England in 1540, Catherine made a fatal compounding administrative error. Desperate for familiar faces in a terrifying hostile court and likely attempting to buy the silence of those who knew her history, she brought several of her former companions from the Lambeth household into her royal retinue. Katherine Tylney was among them. Upon entering the royal household, Katherine Tylney was appointed to the position of chamberer. To a modern observer, the title implies a mere domestic servant, a maid tasked with folding clothes and fetching water. In the political anatomy of the Tudor court, however, a chamberer held a position of immense logistical power and profound physical vulnerability. The royal apartments were structured as a series of concentric, increasingly restricted security zones. The outermost rooms, the presence chamber, and the guard chamber were accessible to the broader court. Beyond those lay the privy chamber, accessible only to the Queen's trusted ladies and high-ranking advisors. The absolute core of this fortress was the Queen's bedchamber and her private closets. A chamberer did not merely dress the Queen or manage her extensive collection of jewels. A chamberer managed the physical boundaries of the Queen's biological existence. Katherine Tylney held the heavy iron keys to the private wardrobes, the inner chambers, and the thick oak doors that separated the Queen's absolute sanctum from the public galleries of the palace. Tylney controlled physical access. In a regime where proximity to the monarch or his consort was the ultimate political currency, controlling the doors transformed a low-born servant into a highly valuable asset. Ambassadors, noblemen, and political operatives constantly sought to penetrate the inner chambers to deliver petitions or extract information. The women who held the keys were constant targets for bribery, coercion, and intense factional surveillance. She was thrust into the center of the Tudor panopticon, charged with guarding the physical boundaries of the Queen's chambers, yet burdened by the catastrophic knowledge of her mistress's past. She was a commoner standing on a geopolitical fault line. The vulnerability of Tylney's position was not merely social, it was codified into the most ruthless, unforgiving statutes of English law. The legal framework surrounding the Queen's physical body made the role of a chamberer a matter of constant, terrifying liability. The Treason Act of 1351, which King Henry VIII had heavily expanded and weaponized throughout his reign, was absolute in its definition of crimes against the state. The legal philosophy of the era dictated that the Queen of England was not a private citizen. Her body was the exclusive, highly guarded property of the crown, serving a single overarching function: to provide legitimate male heirs to secure the Tudor dynasty. Consequently, T.E. any sexual transgression committed by the Queen was not classified as a personal betrayal, adultery, or a matter for the ecclesiastical courts. It was legally defined as an act of high treason. An unfaithful queen threatened to pollute the royal bloodline, invalidate the legal succession, and potentially plunge the entire nation back into the catastrophic dynastic bloodbaths of the Wars of the Roses. Crucially for Katherine Tylney, the Tudor legal system did not only punish the individuals actively committing the treasonous act, the law strictly stipulated the concept of misprision of treason. Misprision of treason established that anyone possessing knowledge of a treasonous act or possessing knowledge of the intention to commit a treasonous act who failed to report that information immediately to the king or his privy council was automatically guilty of a capital offense. The state effectively deputized every servant, courtier, and guard into a mandatory intelligence network, enforcing compliance through the threat of extreme violence. The punishments dictated by the state were specifically designed to obliterate the physical body and serve as maximum public deterrence. For a nobleman, treason resulted in the axe. For a common man, it meant the excruciating horrors of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But for a woman convicted of treason or misprision of treason, often legally categorized as petty treason, the statutory punishment was to be dragged on a wooden hurdle through the filth of the streets to Tyburn, chained to a wooden stake, and burned alive. If the king granted an act of supreme royal mercy, the sentence might be commuted to beheading. Positioned at the absolute threshold of the queen's private sanctum, she was tasked with serving a teenager she knew to be reckless and sexually compromised, while simultaneously chained to a ruthless legal mechanism that demanded her own agonizing execution in the flames. If she failed to police the queen's behavior, she was legally required to act as the king's spy against her own mistress. The delicate, highly unstable equilibrium of Catherine Howard's household completely shattered during the royal progress to the north in the summer and autumn of 1541. This expedition was not a leisurely royal vacation. It was a massive, unprecedented, and highly aggressive logistical undertaking. 5 years earlier, the northern counties of England, specifically Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, had erupted in a massive Catholic-led rebellion known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, directly challenging Henry VIII's religious reforms and his authority. Although the rebellion had been crushed and its leaders brutally executed, the region remained deeply resentful and politically volatile. Henry VIII orchestrated the 1541 progress as a massive display of overwhelming, unchallengeable military and political dominance. The king moved an army of roughly 5,000 courtiers, soldiers, administrators, and heavily armed guards hundreds of miles from the comforts of London into the hostile northern territories. The logistics of moving a mobile city of this size placed a crushing strain on the royal household. The progress did not halt at luxurious modern palaces. It relied on ancient, heavy, fortified medieval strongholds like Lincoln Castle, Pontefract Castle, and the King's Manor at York. The quarters in these fortresses were cramped, damp, freezing, and entirely unfamiliar. The intricate, highly controlled security zones of Whitehall Palace were replaced by improvised boundaries and temporary partitions. The grueling nature of the travel across poor 16th century roads caused the king's chronic medical conditions to deteriorate rapidly. The constant movement, the long hours in the saddle, and the sheer physical exhaustion caused the purulent ulcer on Henry's leg to flare up violently. The necrotic wound became severely infected, effectively crippling the monarch. Henry was rendered entirely bedridden, was heavily medicated, feverish, suffering from intense physical agony, and consequently highly murderous in his temper. He lashed out at his advisors, his physicians, and his servants. The king's private apartments, which Catherine Howard was obligated to visit, were transformed into a grim, dark sick room that smelled overwhelmingly of decaying human flesh and surgical ointments. Catherine Howard was effectively trapped. She was confined to these damp, unfamiliar northern castles, surrounded by thousands of heavily armed men and tethered to an obese, rotting, highly volatile tyrant. She was geographically cut off from her power base in London, isolated from her family, and buckling under the intense psychological pressure of her position. Desperate for a psychological escape from her grim reality, seeking the validation of her youth, and entirely lacking the political maturity to understand the lethal surveillance closing in around her, Catherine Howard made a catastrophic miscalculation. While the king lay incapacitated in the adjoining staterooms, the queen initiated a highly dangerous, illicit sexual relationship with a man who had the capacity to bypass the guards. She targeted a man who operated at the absolute center of the king's inner circle, the catalyst for the queen's destruction and the architect of Katherine Tylney's ultimate nightmare, had arrived at the queen's locked door. Thomas Culpeper was not a marginalized courtier or a distant, powerless admirer. He held the specific, highly elevated title of Gentleman of the Privy Chamber. In the rigid hierarchy of the Tudor court, this was a position of supreme logistical and political intimacy. Culpeper slept in the king's own bedchamber, managed the monarch's most private physical needs, and enjoyed Henry's absolute blinding favor. The king trusted Culpeper explicitly, treating him with a paternal indulgence that frequently shielded the younger man from the standard lethal consequences of the law. This political immunity was not theoretical. It was a proven historical fact. Culpeper was heavily armed, notoriously arrogant, and possessed a violent, predatory temper. The historical record demonstrates he had previously been pardoned by the king for a horrific crime involving the murder of a park keeper and the brutal assault of the man's wife. The king had directly intervened to save his favorite from the gallows. This was the man who targeted the queen. The combination of Catherine Howard's desperate psychological need for affection, her isolation in the north, and Culpeper's untouchable, ruthless ambition created a highly volatile dynamic within the claustrophobic confines of the royal progress. However, Catherine and Culpeper could not execute this affair in a vacuum. The spatial architecture and the intense security protocols of a royal fortress explicitly prevented casual, undocumented encounters. They required a logistical operator. The true architect of this treason was Lady Jane Rochford, a senior lady of the bedchamber and the widow of George Boleyn. Rochford manipulated the volatile dynamic, operating as the chief orchestrator who actively arranged the meetings, passed the letters, and commanded the physical space. Catherine Tylney, possessing the physical keys to the Queen's perimeter, was not the mastermind. She was the involuntary, low-ranking instrument. She was drafted into the role of accomplice, forced by a senior aristocrat to manipulate the heavy barriers of the guarded castles, while the king slept just rooms away. The mechanics of the affair were terrifying in their simplicity and their absolute risk. Deep in the night, usually approaching 11 o'clock, the palace would settle into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the scheduled patrols of the king's yeoman guards and the heavy steps of the changing watch. Tilney, operating in near total darkness, was forced to leave the relative safety of her own quarters. She navigated the narrow, freezing stone corridors of the back stairs, the hidden secondary network of passages used exclusively by servants to move through the castle without traversing the illuminated, heavily guarded main public galleries, armed with a single candle to avoid drawing the attention of the exterior guards. Tilney unlocked the heavy wooden doors leading from the Queen's private apartments to the back stairwell. She stood in the freezing draft of the stone corridor, waiting for Culpeper to emerge from the shadows of the castle. She then guided the king's heavily armed favorite past the locked doors, through the antechambers, and directly into the Queen's bedchamber. Once Culpeper was inside, Tilney's physical and psychological ordeal intensified exponentially. She did not return to her bed. She, alongside another trusted chamberer named Margaret Morton, was ordered to stand guard in the freezing corridor outside the bedroom door. These vigils lasted for grueling, uninterrupted hours. The psychological toll of this waiting forms the core of Tilney's historical nightmare. Every distant slam of a heavy oak door echoing through the fortress, every clatter of a guard's halberd against the stone floor, every sudden gust of wind rattling the tapestries signaled imminent destruction. She was a commoner standing in the dark between the supreme sovereign of England and his unfaithful wife. If Henry woke and demanded to see his queen, or if a routine guard patrol altered its route and discovered the unlocked back doors, Tilney would be the first person apprehended by the state security apparatus. She knew with absolute chilling certainty that while the aristocrats inside the room might face the relatively swift mercy of the axe, a servant caught actively facilitating the cuckolding of the king would face the most barbaric instruments of execution the state possessed. The Treason Act demanded the flames for her complicity. She stood in the cold night after night at Lincoln, at Pontefract, and at York, effective, Ely guarding her own death warrant, listening to the muffled sounds of treason occurring just inches away. The danger escalated rapidly as the progress continued through the northern counties. The lovers abandoned all standard operational caution. Arrogance replaced the initial fear of discovery. Catherine Howard began acting with reckless indiscretion, treating the affair not as a matter of immediate life and death within a surveillance state, but as a dramatic courtly romance. She committed the ultimate operational failure. She generated physical evidence. Catherine wrote highly incriminating letters to Culpeper, one of which survives in the historical archives today, pledging her unwavering love and obedience to him rather than the king. She sent Tilney to deliver intricate, highly recognizable gifts, velvet caps, ribbons, and rings. Through these actions, Tilney was transformed from a passive night watchman into an active physical courier of treasonous evidence, moving contraband directly past the king's security perimeter. Furthermore, the physical reality of the morning after fell entirely to the chamberers. Tilney had to manage the state of the Queen's bed, the linens, and the immediate physical environment to ensure absolutely no trace of Culpeper's late-night presence remained. When the Queen's other ladies-in-waiting, many of whom were loyal to rival political factions, arrived for the morning dressing rituals, the crushing logistical burden of concealing a capital crime rested entirely on the shoulders of the low-ranking staff. They were forced to operate a flawless cover-up every single morning while surrounded by the most sophisticated intelligence network in Europe. the internal security of the Queen's household finally collapsed entirely under the weight of its own past. During the Northern Progress, men who possessed knowledge of Catherine's sexual history at Lambeth realized her extreme vulnerability. They recognized that the Queen of England was highly susceptible to extortion. Francis Derham, the man who had engaged in a fully consummated physical relationship with Catherine before she ascended the throne, arrived at the royal court. He did not ask for a favor. He aggressively demanded a prominent, salaried position within her household. Terrified of exposure and entirely lacking the political ruthlessness to eliminate the threat, Catherine capitulated. She appointed her former lover as her private secretary, granting him unrestricted access to her inner chambers and control over her correspondence. The Queen's private rooms were now populated by her current lover, and Culpeper, her former lover, Derham, and a cadre of terrified servants buckling under the severe psychological strain of holding these explosive secrets. The atmosphere became highly toxic and logistically unsustainable. Derham acted with aggressive familiarity toward the Queen, boasting of his previous connection to her and drawing the immediate suspicion of the senior ladies in waiting. Whispers began to circulate among the lesser servants. The security perimeter Tilney was forced to manage was disintegrating from the inside. She was living in a state of severe hyperarousal. Her nervous system constantly braced for the inevitable knock at the door, knowing that the sheer volume of people aware of the Queen's transgressions guaranteed their eventual discovery. The mechanism of their destruction, however, would be triggered entirely outside the Queen's control, orchestrated by a rival political faction waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The mechanism of destruction that annihilated the Queen's household was not triggered by a guard catching Thomas Culpeper in the corridors, nor by Katherine Tylney failing to lock a door. The collapse originated miles away from the royal palaces, generated entirely outside the Queen's control by individuals who had no direct access to the current court. The Tudor state did not require a smoking gun in the present. It simply required actionable intelligence from the past. John Lascelles was a committed Protestant reformer. In the deeply polarized factional landscape of 1541, men like Lascelles viewed the Catholic Howard faction, and by extension Queen Catherine Howard, as an existential threat to the English Reformation. Lascelles operated within the reformist intelligence networks, constantly gathering information that could be weaponized against the conservative lords. He found the ultimate political weapon within his own family. John Lascelles had a sister, Mary Hall. Years earlier, Mary had served as a nurse in the Lambeth household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. She had lived in the same maiden's chamber as Catherine Howard and Katherine Tylney. During a casual conversation, John Lascelles suggested to his sister that she should seek a position in the new Queen's household, utilizing her past connection to Catherine to secure a lucrative royal appointment. Mary Hall flatly refused. When pressed by her brother for her reasoning, Mary recounted the explicit forensic details of Catherine's past behavior at Lambeth. She detailed the physical encounters with the music teacher, Henry Mannix, and outlined the fully consummated, established sexual relationship with Francis Derham. Mary possessed direct eyewitness knowledge of the severe security breaches in the Dowager Duchess's household. John Lascelles instantly recognized the magnitude of what he had been told. This was not mere servant gossip. It was a state secret that legally invalidated the king's marriage. If Catherine Howard was pre-contracted to Francis Derham, a legally binding status in 16th century ecclesiastical law created by their sexual relationship and mutual promises, her subsequent marriage to King Henry VIII was bigamous, illegitimate, and highly treasonous. Lascelles took this intelligence and bypassed standard legal channels. He carried it directly to the highest-ranking Protestant official in the Iowa-Dorset, Ulm, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, received Lascelles' report with profound alarm. As the architect of the English Reformation, Cranmer was the primary political target of the Duke of Norfolk and the conservative Catholic faction. Cranmer understood that if the Howards discovered he possessed this information and suppressed it, they would execute him for misprision of treason. However, acting on the intelligence was equally dangerous. Delivering this specific news to Henry VIII was a matter of extreme physical risk. The king was deeply publicly infatuated with his young wife. Only a day prior, Henry had ordered his bishops to lead the nation in public thanksgiving for the good life he enjoyed with his new queen. Believing he had finally found a flawless, pure consort after decades of marital disaster. If Cranmer verbally presented allegations of the queen's promiscuity directly to the king's face, Henry's immediate volatile reaction could be lethal. The king was highly prone to executing messengers who brought him news that damaged his ego or contradicted his established reality. A verbal accusation could easily be dismissed by the king as malicious Protestant slander, resulting in Cranmer being dragged to the block for insulting the sovereign's wife. Cranmer executed a cold, calculated administrative maneuver to protect himself. He refused to speak the words. Instead, he compiled the allegations provided by Lascelles and Mary Hall into a highly detailed, meticulously drafted document. He laid out the timeline, the names of the individuals involved, and the specific nature of the transgressions at Lambeth. He constructed a paper trail that could not be ignored or easily dismissed as a verbal misunderstanding. On November 1st, 1541, the Feast of All Saints, King Henry VIII attended Mass in the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. The atmosphere was celebratory, honoring the religious feast day. While the king was actively engaged in his prayers, Archbishop Cranmer quietly approached the royal pew. Without speaking a word, Cranmer placed the sealed letter directly on Henry's seat, bowed, and immediately withdrew from the chapel, placing physical distance between himself and the impending explosion. King Henry VIII read Cranmer's letter in the privacy of his chambers. The initial royal reaction was not rage, but absolute stubborn disbelief. Henry's ego simply could not process the possibility that he, the supreme sovereign of England, had been deceived by a teenager and saddled with a woman possessing a highly documented, scandalous past. He initially concluded that the letter was a forgery or a malicious fabrication engineered by the Protestant faction to destroy his happiness. However, the legal framework of the Tudor state dictated that any formal allegation of treason against the monarch's person must be investigated. Henry ordered a covert, highly restricted inquiry. He commanded his most trusted and ruthless counselors, Thomas Wriothesley and the Earl of Southampton, to discreetly locate John Lascelles and Mary Hall and interrogate them. The king explicitly ordered that the investigation be conducted silently. He did not want the Queen or the Howard faction alerted until the allegations were either proven or dismissed. Wriothesley and Southampton executed their orders with clinical efficiency. They intercepted Lascelles and Hall away from the court. Under intense questioning, both witnesses held firm, repeating their specific, detailed accounts of the Queen's prior sexual history. The interrogators realized immediately that the witnesses were credible and that the intelligence was accurate. Furthermore, they realized that Francis Derham, one of the men named in the report, was currently residing within the royal palaces, operating as the Queen's private secretary. When Wriothesley and Southampton delivered the verified findings back to Henry VIII, the king's denial shattered. The Realeza, teeing that he was sharing his bed, his court, and his absolute authority with a woman who had previously belonged to a minor gentleman pensioner, broke the king's psychological stability. The state's response shifted instantly from a covert inquiry to an overwhelming, overt dismantling of a treasonous network. There was no gentle inquiry, no opportunity for the Queen to explain herself, and no formal legal notification. The Tudor state moved to neutralize the threat with ruthless, coordinated speed. Armed guards, under the direct command of the Privy Council, moved rapidly through Hampton Court Palace to seal the Queen's apartments. All exits were blocked. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting and servants were ordered to step away from her. Catherine Howard was immediately confined to her rooms. Unprepared for the sudden assault, possessing no political allies capable of defying the king's guards, and realizing that her past had finally caught up to her, Catherine collapsed into severe hysterics. She screamed, physically fought the guards, and had to be forcibly restrained as the reality of her execution materialized before her. Simultaneously, the king's counselors executed a textbook dismantling of the logistical staff. Wriothesley and Thomas Audley knew that proving premarital indiscretions at Lambeth was politically damaging, but proving postmarital adultery was required to secure a legally unassailable execution. To build a watertight legal case of high treason against the Queen, the state needed the testimony of the people who controlled her physical space. The counselors did not interrogate the high-ranking aristocrats. They targeted the personnel who held the keys. Katherine Tylney, Margaret Morton, and the other chamberers were abruptly apprehended within the palace corridors. They were given no time to collect their belongings or coordinate their defenses. They were immediately stripped of their royal positions. The guards systematically separated the women from one another, ensuring they could not align their stories or establish a unified cover-up. Under heavy armed guard, Katherine Tylney was escorted out of the opulent environment of Hampton Court. She was placed on a barge and transported silently down the River Thames, passing under the arches of London Bridge, heading directly toward the most terrifying administrative facility in the kingdom, the Tower of London. The Tower of London was not merely a medieval castle functioning as a prison. It was a highly sophisticated architectural machine designed specifically to break human beings and extract information for the state. When Katherine Tylney was processed through the fortified gates, she entered a facility engineered to strip away all sense of security, status, and hope. She was thrown into a damp, freezing stone cell, entirely isolated from the outside world. She had no access to legal counsel, no ability to contact her family, and no knowledge of what the other prisoners were saying. The Tudor state understood that isolation was a primary weapon in interrogation. The interrogation process employed by the Privy Council against low-ranking individuals like Tilney did not immediately necessitate the application of physical torture. The architecture of terror and the statutory weight of the law were entirely sufficient. Men like Thomas Wriothesley visited her cell, employing a methodical psychological dismantling. They relentlessly pressed her for details regarding the Queen's movements during the Northern Progress. They did not ask vague questions. They presented her with specific dates, specific locations at Lincoln and Pontefract, and demanded she account for the locked doors. They explicitly reminded her of the Treason Act. They outlined the legal definition of misprision of treason, ensuring Tilney understood that her silence was legally equivalent to actively plotting the king's death. The interrogators detailed the specific agonizing methods of execution reserved for common women who withheld information from the crown, the hurdle, the stake, and the fire. More devastating than the verbal threats delivered by the counselors was the inescapable auditory environment of the fortress. The Tower of London was an active interrogation center, and sound traveled easily through the heavy stone corridors. Francis Derham had been arrested simultaneously and was being held and interrogated within the same facility. Derham, realizing his life was entirely forfeit, attempted to utilize a desperate legal technicality. During his interrogations, he openly confessed to the premarital sexual relationship with Katherine Howard at Lambeth, recognizing that Mary Hall's testimony made it impossible to deny. However, he stubbornly and aggressively refused to confess to committing adultery with the Queen after her marriage to the king. Derham knew that premarital sex, while disastrous, might not meet the strict statutory definition of high treason if no pre-contract was proven. Postmarital adultery with the king's wife guaranteed a gruesome death. Because Derham refused to supply the state with the specific confession required to definitively execute the Queen for postmarital treason, the Privy Council formally authorized the use of physical torture. Derham was taken to the subterranean levels of the tower and placed on the rack. This instrument was a heavy wooden frame, equipped with rollers at both ends. The prisoner's wrists and ankles were bound to the rollers with thick ropes. As the interrogators demanded information, executioners operated a ratcheting mechanism, mechanically turning the rollers in opposite directions. The device was designed to slowly, agonizingly stretch the human body beyond its biological limits. From the confines of her nearby cell, Katherine Tylney could hear the entire process. She heard the heavy mechanical clatter of the wooden gears ratcheting backward. She heard the tension of the ropes. Most terrifyingly, she heard the inhuman, guttural screams of Francis Derham being physically pulled apart. The rack methodically dislocated shoulders, hips, and knees. It tore muscle tissue and snapped ligaments under the massive mechanical strain. The sound of a man's joints popping and his body breaking under state-sanctioned violence echoed directly into Tilney's cell. Faced with the visceral auditory reality of physical destruction, the psychological barrier of servant loyalty evaporated entirely. Katherine Tylney was a pragmatist trapped in a lethal apparatus. She realized with absolute clarity that the Queen was a doomed woman. The Tudor state possessed the intelligence, the physical custody of the suspects, and the unyielding political will to execute Katherine Howard. Furthermore, Tilney understood that the powerful Howard family, ruthless in their own self-preservation, were already aggressively distancing themselves from the fallout. The Duke of Norfolk, attempting to save his own neck from the king's rage, publicly denounced his niece, actively participating in the investigations against her. No aristocratic faction, no noble lord, and no rescue party was coming to the Tower of London to save a chamberer who held the door for a traitor. Survival within the Tudor panopticon dictated total, unhesitating capitulation to the state. If Tilney continued to protect the Queen, she would join Derham on the rack and follow him to the flames at Tyburn. The state required a witness to lock the case against Katherine Howard, and Tilney possessed the exact logistical data they required. Katherine Tylney signaled her interrogators. She was ready to speak. Katherine Tylney was brought from her freezing cell into the formal interrogation chambers of the Tower of London. She stood before the highest lords of the realm, men who represented the absolute, uncompromising authority of the Tudor state. The psychological dismantling had been successful. The auditory horrors of Francis Derham's torture are now showing through the stone walls, combined with the crushing legal reality of the Treason Act, had eradicated any lingering notions of servant loyalty or aristocratic protection. Tilney understood that her life hinged entirely on the quality and specificity of the intelligence she could provide. She did not offer vague suspicions, court gossip, or circumstantial hearsay. She delivered a deposition that functioned as the final, unassailable nail in the Queen's coffin. She provided devastating, actionable forensic intelligence that the Privy Council required to legally execute a monarch. The historical archives hold the grim reality of her recorded testimony. Tilney detailed the exact geographic locations of the treason, specifically naming the heavy, fortified castles at Lincoln and Pontefract during the Northern Progress. She confirmed her exact active role in the logistical operation, stating clearly that she held the keys and physically unlocked the doors leading to the back stairs. She explicitly named Thomas Culpeper, identifying the king's highly favored gentleman of the Privy Chamber as the man she guided through the darkness. Most critically, she provided the precise timeline that proved the opportunity for the capital crime. Tilney testified that she, alongside Margaret Morton, stood guard in the freezing corridor while Culpeper remained inside the Queen's private bedroom with the door secured. She explicitly stated that these illicit meetings were not brief encounters. Culpeper did not depart the Queen's chambers until 2 or 3 in the morning. This testimony was the exact clinical mechanism the Crown needed. It established access, it identified the specific individuals, and it proved an extended timeline of unsupervised isolation between the Queen and another man. It provided the state with the exact physical evidence required to execute a sovereign consort. It was legally clean, highly precise, and entirely lethal to Catherine Howard. When this compiled EVI, dense, heavily anchored and verified by Katherine Tylney's detailed deposition, was presented to King Henry VIII. The monarch's reaction was intensely volatile and entirely stripped of traditional royal dignity. Henry VIII did not react with the cold, calculated stoicism of a hardened statesman. He broke down completely in front of his stunned, hardened counselors. He wept uncontrollably, lamenting his horrific luck in wives and wallowing in an intense, highly public display of self-pity. For a man whose entire political persona was constructed around projecting unchallengeable dominant masculinity, the undeniable documented proof that he had been systematically deceived and cuckolded by a teenager and one of his closest personal attendants was a catastrophic psychological blow. However, in the mechanics of a dictatorship, royal self-pity rapidly transmutes into a violent, bloodthirsty rage. The king's grief was replaced by a furious demand to restore his shattered authority through absolute physical annihilation. He demanded a sword so he might personally ride to the Tower and strike the Queen down himself, screaming to his counselors that she had never had such delight in her lovers, as she should have torture in her death. He demanded the immediate execution of everyone involved in the conspiracy, regardless of their rank or past favor. The state apparatus was ordered to prepare the scaffolds. In the midst of this royal bloodlust, Katherine Tylney did not secure her immediate freedom. The Privy Council possessed exactly the intelligence they needed to proceed with the executions, but they still brought the full weight of the law upon her. They recognized the brutal legal reality. Tilney was statutorily guilty of misprision of treason. By holding the keys, standing guard, and failing to report the crime the moment it occurred, she had forfeited her life under English law. The men operating the Tudor state, men like Thomas Wriothesley, were pragmatic political operators and not moral absolutists. They recognized that executing a low-born chamberer served no strategic or political purpose. Tilney had no faction, no wealth to confiscate, and no political influence. Her death would yield nothing for the crown. However, the transactional logic of the Tudor state was agonizing. In December 1541, Tilney was formally convicted of misprision of treason. The state systematically stripped her of all personal possessions, confiscated her goods, and sentenced her to life imprisonment. For months she rotted in the freezing, isolated confines of the Tower of London. She sat in the darkness, listening to the echoes of Culpeper and Dereham being slaughtered at Tyburn, waiting entirely at the volatile mercy of the crown. It was not until late February 1542, only after Katherine Howard's severed head had been buried beneath the chapel floor, that the crown finalized its legal transaction. The state formally issued Katherine Tylney a royal pardon, finally releasing her from the fortress, effectively trading the physical life of the sovereign for the testimony of the servant. The legal machinery moved swiftly to execute the king's vengeance. The state dealt with the male conspirators first. On December 10th, 1541, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were extracted from the tower and dragged on wooden hurdles through the muddy, freezing streets of London to the execution grounds at Tyburn. The state dispensed justice based heavily on class and past royal favor, resulting in a stark contrast in their final moments. Thomas Culpeper, leaning heavily on his former highly elevated status as the king's favorite and his aristocratic connections, petitioned the crown for mercy regarding the method of his death. The king granted the request. Culpeper received the relatively swift aristocratic mercy of a simple beheading. Following the strike of the axe, his severed head was taken and displayed on a pike above London Bridge. Francis Dereham was afforded no such mercy. Because of his lower social status, and because he had stubbornly refused to confess to post-marital adultery, forcing the state to rely heavily on the depositions of the servants to build the case, the king ordered the maximum statutory punishment. Dereham suffered the full catastrophic and highly public punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. He was hanged until nearly unconscious, cut down alive, disemboweled, castrated, and his organs were burned before his eyes, before his body was finally hacked into 4 pieces and distributed across the city gates. 2 months later, the state turned its focused attention to the Queen. To avoid the massive public humiliation and political instability of subjecting the king's wife to a formal public trial, where the intimate, embarrassing details of the king's cuckolding would be read aloud in an open court, the state utilized its ultimate legislative weapon. Parliament was convened and rapidly passed a Bill of Attainder. This was a specific legislative act that declared a person guilty of treason by state decree, entirely bypassing the judicial system, the right to a defense, and the requirement for a jury trial. The bill explicitly condemned Katherine Howard to death. On the freezing morning of February 13th, 1542, Katherine Howard was led out of her quarters and onto the execution green within the walls of the Tower of London. She was completely broken, terrified, physically exhausted, and drained of the vibrant energy that had defined her brief reign, she required physical assistance from the guards, merely to climb the wooden steps of the scaffold. She addressed the small, selected crowd, confessing her sins in accordance with the strict protocols of state executions, though she maintained to the end that she had not betrayed the king after their marriage. She knelt, placed her neck on the heavy wooden block, and the executioner severed her head with a single blow. Lady Rochford, the older aristocratic woman in Lady O, left the bedchamber, who had also actively facilitated the affair, and who was deemed by the state to have gone entirely mad from terror during her confinement in the Tower, was dragged onto the scaffold and executed immediately afterward, while the Queen's headless body was unceremoniously bundled into coarse cloth and buried rapidly beneath the cold stone floor of the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. Katherine Tylney was processed out of the fortress. The historical implications of this catastrophic scandal fundamentally reshaped the architecture of English law. Furious, deeply humiliated, and absolutely determined to ensure he could never be compromised again, Henry VIII forced a draconian new legislative framework through Parliament. He first utilized the royal assent by Commission Act 1541. This was a precise procedural maneuver, allowing his counselors to sign the Queen's execution warrant on his behalf, effectively sparing the traumatized king the psychological reality of physically condemning his own wife to death. However, it was the heavily expanded Treason Act 1541 that permanently altered the legal landscape of the nation. It formally became a capital offense for an unchaste woman to marry the King of England without explicitly disclosing her sexual history prior to the marriage, directly resulting from the actions of Katherine Tylney and the Lambeth household. This act explicitly weaponized the domestic staff. It codified into law that any person possessing knowledge of the Queen's illicit behavior must report it directly to the King's Council within 20 days, transforming every chamberer and lady-in-waiting into a legally mandated intelligence operative. Katherine Tylney's story remains a stark, highly unromanticized documentation of the mechanics of survival within a totalitarian framework. While Catherine Howard treated the deadly environment of the Tudor court like a game of romantic intrigue, Tilney understood exactly how the machinery worked. The traditional bonds of aristocratic service were ultimately replaced by a harsh, overriding biological imperative to live. She survived the Tudor court, but the price of her physical freedom was a permanent psychological imprisonment. Cast out of the royal household, stripped of her status, and erased from subsequent historical records, she lived out her days in complete anonymity, forever marked as the terrified watcher in the dark who bought her own breath with her mistress's blood.